One of the main strands of my research, this is a new strand. I'm actually very excited. I've been awarded a, I think, 1.3 million euro grant for this. It's a project that is called BUMP, Better Understanding the Metaphysics of Pregnancy. And this project is about the metaphysical relationship between the fetus and the mother. And what I mean by metaphysics is kind of the nature of the relationship. So what you find very widely in society, and this is very well described, is that we have this construal and portrayal of the fetus as a baby within a mother, right? Where it's kind of a separate creature living in but not being part of the rest of the person. And I want to investigate whether the image kind of holds up, whether that's true. So I ask questions like, is the fetus a part of the maternal organism or is it not? And for that I look at accounts of the organism in philosophy biology. I ask if it is a part of the maternal organism, which is what I argue, then what does that mean for us as persons? Does that mean that your baby used to be a part of you as a woman? Does that mean that we used to be a part of our mother? What does that mean for our intergenerational relations? What does that mean for the way that we construe ourselves as individuals? What does it mean for when you started? So these are the kind of questions that I'm very interested in. And I think this is a really exciting piece of research. One of the really interesting things about this research is that it's been so overlooked in philosophy. So pregnancy and birth are obviously not liminal, weird, unusual states. I mean, this is how every single one of us comes to be. And you'd think that an awful lot of philosophy would be focused on how do we come to be, right? What is this very interesting 9-month process, which is quite long, where you seem to get this intertwinement or, you know, in a very intimate relationship between a mother and offspring. But there is virtually no consideration of this. So what you get is a huge amount of focus on abortion and the personhood and of the fetus, but that is kind of drowned out almost any other concern. And I think one thing that goes on here, and this I think is interesting for the history of women's equality, is that of course the vast majority of even contemporary philosophers, but especially historically influential philosophy figures, were men, right? Were not people that were pregnant. And in fact, were predominantly men who were just about as far removed from pregnancy and the domestic sphere as they could be, right? Because they might have been in monasteries or in Oxford colleges, or they might have been ancient Greeks who thought that the highest form of love was with other men. So pregnancy just wasn't really part, I think, of what was an obvious thing to think about, especially not from the first person perspective, for the vast majority of historical philosophers. So where something like, you know, death is a huge philosophical topic, birth and pregnancy are virtually absent. And that's one of the things I'm trying to change. Another large component of that are the ethical questions that are related to pregnancy and birth. So again, I think there are lots of very interesting ethical questions about pregnancy and birth. Again, the almost sole focus here has been on abortion and the personhood of the fetus, which is a huge topic. But there are reams of moral questions that pregnant women face every day that I think are very interesting and very common and thoroughly overlooked. So an example of this is birth, when in a current situation a woman chooses kind of a particular mode of birth, right? Giving birth in a hospital, planning to give birth at home. You know, going with a forceps delivery or going for an elective cesarean section, she constantly has to trade a different risk profile between herself and the fetus. Right? Some of these options are slightly riskier in various ways for the mother, some are slightly riskier for the fetus. In some cases, the mother ends up with a little bit more of the bad outcomes, in some cases the fetus. And that raises very interesting questions, right? How do you make such a choice morally? And of course, philosophers have thought very much about how you make moral choices between two very separate people, right? Myself and another, right? Should I help you if you're starving or not? How this happens if these people are kind of physically bound up is something that they just haven't thought about, and it's something that we are trying to think about. One of the things I'm inclined to think there is that very often pregnant women get portrayed as harming their fetuses, so they harm their fetuses, people write, or their future babies, when they don't choose the safest birth option, or they harm their fetuses if they drink alcohol, or they harm their fetuses if they smoke. And I actually think that that is not quite right. So when we think of doing harm, we tend to think of kind of actively interfering with somebody and making them worse off, as opposed to what we call letting harm happen or allowing harm, where you just fail to intervene in somebody being worse off than they could have been. So the big difference here is, right, I mean, when I push somebody into a pond and they drown, I've harmed them. Whereas if somebody is in a pond and I fail to pull them out, I've kind of just let them drown. And we think very differently of the two people. They might both be a bit evil, but the person that pushes somebody in a pond to let them drown, we think is much worse than the person who didn't save somebody. And I think that the way you should think about what pregnant women do in terms of accruing risk to their fetus is much more like failing to save their fetuses than it is like actively harming their fetuses. But we treat socially women who drink alcohol and things like that as if they were actively harming their fetuses. So that's a very applied component of some of these ethical questions. Another bit of that is going back to my earlier metaphysics research, right? What the relationship between a fetus and a maternal organism is. If you think that a fetus is part of the mother, then looking as a pregnant woman towards your obligations to your kind of future self as a mother and the offspring, when you face these kind of trade-offs, starts to look more like making this trade-off between two future selves, rather than a trade-off between a self and another. And I think that too is interesting, because we treat obligations towards future selves much differently from the way in which we treat obligations towards others. So you might wonder why I'm doing this research and why I'm doing it now. So I think part of the questions I ask are actually pretty timeless, right? So the question about what is the relationship in pregnancy and what is the relationship between a fetus and a maternal organism, those are really important and really timeless questions, and ones that different cultures give different answers on, right? You have cultures who are highly matrilineal and who do think that you literally kind of came out of your mother and are kind of part of that line and never properly separate. As I said, I think one of the reasons for why now is that, yeah, I do blame the absence of women historically in philosophy for the lack of focus on these kind of questions, and other people have said that before, and some female philosophers have looked at issues to do with birth. So, I mean, Hannah Arendt has spoken about natality, and Ulus Irigaray has spoken about fundamental matricide and the absence of women in the way we think about the world. But then the philosophy I do, again, is quite different from what they do in ways I won't go into. On the other hand, I think there are also things about this that are highly topical. So with a lot of these ethical questions, the only reason that we really realize some of these things is because we have so much scientific research now that we are aware of and can worry about all these minute risks, right? The risks you take by drinking alcohol, and the risks you take by eating raw fish, and the risks you take by choosing a home birth versus a hospital birth. 10, 20 years ago, we just wouldn't have had the data to uncover those tiny risk profiles, and so we wouldn't have known that these are things to worry about. Now that we know that you could worry about them, we seem to require that pregnant women do worry about them, and that they police themselves to an extreme degree, and I think that may not be justified. So I think part of it is just that we are ever uncovering more small risks, and we are becoming ever more risk averse as a society. Another component that makes this perhaps especially interesting is, of course, we can do things now like surrogate pregnancy. And surrogate pregnancy means that you start to have questions, you get questions where the person doing the pregnancy and the person providing the egg aren't necessarily the same people. And so what used to be one kind of unit of motherhood gets now spread out into somebody who does the pregnancy and somebody who, a bit like the father always has done, just provides some genetic material. And that raises interesting questions of, well, how in terms of parenthood should those things be balanced? And I think, again, we can there be at the risk of overemphasizing the importance of genetic relatedness and underemphasizing the importance of pregnancy as a process and a thing of intertwinement. So that's another thing that perhaps makes it more topical now.